Hey, class, welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. We are getting into the home stretch of this course in terms of the content. We only have 4 chapters to go. We have the last 4 chapters of this course. We have chapter 13, which we'll do today, looking at the topic of careers and work. For many of you going to college, I mean, this is a topic that is very much on your mind. I mean, it's probably the reason that maybe influenced you to decide to pursue higher education. So the first section we're going to look at in this chapter is what goes into choosing a career. How do people reach those decisions? There's a number of factors that go into it. So by the end of this section, you'll look at and be able to describe personal and family influences on job choice. You'll be able to list helpful resources of career information and important aspects of potential occupations, clarify the role of occupational interest inventories in career decisions. Maybe you yourself took one of those inventories when trying to figure out what you wanted to do with your life. And then outline 6 important considerations in choosing an occupation, just some things that you might want to mull over. So what are some things to consider when choosing a career? There are personal characteristics, there are family influences, for example, personal characteristics. Ideally, when you are making that career choice, it tends to be easier, tends to go, more well for individuals who have more secure attachments, starting in childhood, adolescence into adulthood, and tend to have higher self-efficacy about work, about their ability to perform any given job. Intelligence, which I think we've talked about briefly before, also factors in. It's a predictor of the likelihood of entering certain professions, but obviously it's not the end all be all when it comes to success. There are also certain aptitudes that are necessary when it comes to predicting, what jobs individuals take, and those tend to be more important, perhaps, than general intelligence. Like your aptitude in mathematics, for example, might be one of those skills that is important in terms of being like a scientist or a researcher or a data scientist or something like that. Social skills also contribute to success in many careers, especially any career that involves working with people, which most nowadays do. At least, in American society, we're talking about sort of people-oriented careers. Other personal characteristics: ideally, you want a career that matches your interest in terms of what motivates you, things in the world that maybe excite you and interests you. The more that the career fits, into your interests, obviously, the better. And it's also best in terms of finding a career that's compatible with your personality. And we've spent an entire chapter talking about personality, and we'll look at some dimensions of personality kind of going forward that are worth considering when thinking about careers. Other influences: your family, whether we're talking about biological or otherwise, your family background, where your parents and other children, where they're obtaining levels of education. It can be a huge predictor in terms of, the career choices you have available and what you ultimately decide to do. Research shows that middle income background typically is associated with more high paying professions, whereas more low income background from a lower socioeconomic status is more associated with like blue collar occupations, manual labor occupations, for example. Other further family influences to consider: parenting style. We've talked about parenting style previously. It goes hand in hand with socioeconomic status, where we see middle income families tend to encourage their children to be more curious, to be more open to exploration, to new ideas that are typically more associated with professional roles than perhaps with blue collar roles. We also see, kind of conversely, in low income families, they're more likely to teach children to conform, to obey, the types of characteristics that are needed to survive within kind of these subordinate, maybe perhaps even blue collar positions, where not a lot of necessarily, thinking is expected. Other sources, maybe you might research a job characteristic. Maybe you decide, oh, hey, I'm interested in being a doctor. I'm interested in being a lawyer. I'm interested in being a data scientist, whatever. And there are plenty of sources to find information. I mean, one, you could just simply go find somebody who does that job and ask them about it. And that's one way. But we also, we have access to so much information. There's also the Occupational Outlook Handbook. This is a document created by the United States government to kind of provide guides, comprehensive guides to certain occupations. So it helps, reach out to somebody maybe you don't know, but somebody within the field. You can also find information online. The American Psychological Association provides career information about careers specifically in psychology. Mark Lloyd's Career in Psychology is another website you can find if you're specifically interested in working in the field of psychology. So there's plenty of places you can look at. You might even just simply Google the field of interest, if you really are. Some things you might want to consider or be aware of in terms of considering any occupation or career. One, the nature of the work, what are the day-to-day responsibilities? And this is where it might be really beneficial to actually talk to somebody who does it, and maybe you could be lucky and you can shadow that individual if you have the time, and resources to maybe take a day off work and shadow somebody. What are the working conditions? Is it high or low pressure, which might, contribute to things like burnout, which we'll talk about later? Are the conditions pleasant or unpleasant? What are the entry requirements? Like how much education do you need? What sort of training do you need? Once you have the job, is there ongoing training? Is there education? Are there, quote unquote, continuing education credits you have to earn? What opportunities do you have to work with other people? Are you working in isolation or are you collaborating with individuals? And finally, what a lot of people probably consider the most important, which, may or may not be, we can disagree on that, is your potential earnings. How much do you start off and maybe how much will you make as you progress in time? Maybe as you move up in the company, are there opportunities to move up? So lots of things to consider. So other things you might want to consider: your status, what status does this new career or job entail? How much opportunities are there for advancement? Are you given trust and respect by your coworkers? That sort of two-way street of trust and respect. How much do you actually intrinsically value the job? It's one thing to enjoy the job because it pays you well, but is the job intrinsically satisfying? Like, do you feel accomplished? Do you feel benefit from the job beyond just the paycheck? What sort of future outlook is there? Does it kind of help you towards your long-term goals? What sort of job security is it? Is this a temporary job or otherwise? So lots of things to consider when deciding to choose a career field. Another way you can choose a career field are the use of psychological tests. For example, there are occupational interest inventories that are intended to collect data about your interests and measure, kind of collectively how those interests might relate to different jobs and careers. These information, the inventory gleaned from these inventories are based around job satisfaction. Basically, what sort of job would you derive the most satisfaction? Not necessarily what you would have the most success. I mean, ideally, we'd like to see overlap between those two things, but that's not always the case. So the scores on these kind of inventories, these surveys, sort of, they're indicative of how your interests are to the typical interests that people have within those various fields, looking kind of for that overlap, that Venn diagram. Ultimately, though, those, the inventories can point you in the right direction, but they can't choose the career for you. They might narrow it down for you. They might give you a list of 5-10 careers that might interest you, but really that decision comes down to you as the individual. So other considerations that are important when choosing a career: the potential for success in a variety of occupations. Do you have opportunities, linked to like mobility? Can you move up within the company? Can you literally move? Is there mobility? Are you stuck in the same place, or do you have options to move? Can you work remotely? Be cautious in terms of choosing a career solely based on the salary. That is, having a good salary is great, but it's not the end all be all of your job. There might be limits on your career options depending on where you live, what kind of career you have, things you just really need to take into consideration. Your career choice is developmental, meaning it's not, you don't have to figure it out this moment right now. It doesn't have to be solidified in stone. It can change and evolve as your life does. Some career decisions are not easily undone. So, for example, if you go to school for a certain period of time for a certain career field and, that you might, but later on you figure out, oh, maybe I don't like this. I mean, you might be able to go back to school again, but maybe not. So maybe your life circumstances have changed. So it's just something you have to consider. You have to not only take into account your circumstances now, but maybe glance into the future and see how things might change. Do you want a job, a career, or a calling? Those are all three different things. I mean, like when I, turned 16, I just wanted a job. I got a job at Subway, making the minimum wage, and that was nice going for from no money to making a little bit of money. But then as I got older, it was more about, okay, I really just started thinking about a career. And that's obviously what motivated me to pursue certain, degrees in college. And then as I got more and more into teaching and more learning about psychology and teaching psychology, it sort of evolved and became more of a calling. So I think just things you have to consider kind of where you're at within that career, ask yourself some very serious questions. Okay, now we're going to look at some models that explain or attempt to explain how people make career choices and how those develop. The first one we're going to look at is Holland's model of career choice and also Super's stage model of career development. So looking at a couple of models, then we'll identify differences between men and women's career development. They're obviously there are similarities, but there are also differences that are worth mentioning. Holland, the first model we're going to look at is the person environment fit model. Basically, your choice of career fields is tied to 6 stable personality types, or what Holland referred to as personal orientations. And really we can kind of take jobs and put them into 6 categories or work environments that kind of fit with these different personal orientations. And people tend to be most satisfied, they tend to be most successful and stay with their job when there's a fit from the environment and their personal orientation, when there's a match there, when what they choose in terms of their career fits their actual personal orientations. So here are some examples. Someone who is realistic, values concrete and physical tasks. So they might work, in terms of career, being a machine operator, a pilot, a drafts person. I'm not going to go over this entire list, but somebody who maybe is more social in their orientation. They prefer educational, helping, religious careers, social environment, church, music, reading, dramatics. This person might be a counselor, they might be a sociologist, they might be a judge, and so on and so forth. So if you can fit your environment with your personal orientation, that tends to be a really good predictor in terms of your success in your career. And I don't just mean economic success, like actually enjoying your work, actually finding pleasure from it. There's also Super's developmental model, which focuses on how your occupational status develops or changes over time. And it might go through these 5 sort of major stages identified by Super. You have the growth stage, and this might start in childhood, where you start fantasizing about an ideal job. For example, I watched the movie Ghostbusters so many times when I was a kid. By the time I was like 3 or 4, or maybe 5, probably by then, I actually remember, I was like, oh, I want to be a Ghostbuster. Didn't matter that job was not real and was just in a movie, but I fantasized and thought, oh, it'd be so cool. And obviously you have to, that doesn't work out. Eventually that evolves, that grows, and you might move in next into the exploration stage, where you start realistically consider different careers in your youth. You might say, oh, well, my dad works in this field, maybe I'll consider this. Or, I really like my teacher always talks about this person or these people, and I admire that. So you find you become more realistic. You start thinking about things that are realistic options. The establishment stage tends to be where you actually commit to a career and learn to function effectively. Maybe this is the time in which you're going to college, you're learning, maybe you're learning skills. If you're not going to college, maybe you're going to like a Votech, for example. Then you have the maintenance stage. This is midlife. You've been working in this career ideally for a while now. And at this point, you're focusing on, retaining that status and maybe even protecting or gaining security and power within your career field. And then by stage 5, this is when things start to, if life is a roller coaster, your career is also like that. You have your ups and you also have your downs. So, you might have the decline stage, where your activity decreases and you start thinking about retirement. Maybe you're planning for retirement. Maybe you already have a date in mind. And this is what brings the occupational cycle to a close. And we will talk, your textbook talks more about the detail and sub-stages, which are listed here. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this talks about the growth stage happening from 0 to 14, the exploration from about 15 to 25. And, these are not hard, fast dates, but, you can kind of see the sub-stages, and really how we think about our career really evolves a lot as our cognitive abilities evolve. As we understand more about the world, we can understand more about how to choose career fields. Okay, what about women and men? How do they differ in terms of their career choices and career development? In terms of women's career development, about 57% of adult women compared to 70% of men are in the labor force. So there is a gap there. you're more likely to see men in the labor force, even though women do outnumber men. There are gender gaps that there are still other gender gaps in the world of work. For example, men's career paths tend to be more continuous. Women who might enter a career field might be more discontinuous. Let's say if you factor in things like having children, raising a family, so on and so forth. Women's career paths tend to be more discontinuous, obviously, which, as I just mentioned, which also accounts for potentially why salary and status tends to be lower when you compare men and women in the same career field. Women's career fields are more likely to be interrupted by crises that happen in the family for child rearing. I mean, and think about it in the family dynamics. If you're talking about a traditional, heterosexual family, man, husband and wife, I mean, only one of those two people can have a child. So only one of those two people can more or less at that time put their career on hold. So makes sense. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the changing nature or world of work. So after this section, you'll be able to identify 7 work-related trends, describe the relationship between education and salary, which is good news for those of you taking classes right now, a college class, psychology of adjustment. That's great news. Summarize demographic changes, transforming the workplace, and highlighting the challenges that are posed by diversity in the workplace. So here are some workplace trends. Some of these may be surprising, some of them not. One of them, technology is changing the nature of work. We are less of a mechanical society and much more of a digital society, and because of that, workers, in careers, you have to keep up with this stuff. You have to keep up with the latest trends in technology in order to adapt and survive in this new, the new world we live in. Also, having a new attitude about work is required for these changes. You have to be a more active role and also demonstrate your value in order to kind of keep that job security. I know it sounds really bleak, but it's kind of like the, what have you done for me lately kind of attitude. Lifelong learning is a necessity. I mean, because as I mentioned, the workplace in terms of technology is evolving and changing. The skills maybe you learned in your undergrad may be obsolete by the time, you've been in your career for 5, 10, 15 years. So it's important to not only you can't just stop learning just because you're out of school. If that's your attitude, then you're going to have a harder time being successful. Other workplace trends, independent workers are increasing for better or worse. We can debate the economics of this. Independent in the sense that they're not, employees, traditional employees given benefits or things like that. We see independent contracting is more common, like Uber, companies like that. The boundary between work and home is becoming blurred. I mean, think about, our lives in this global pandemic that continues to this day. I mean, obviously we're probably on the decline in terms of the pandemic, but nowadays so many people spend a lot of time working from home compared to what they did prior to the pandemic. Zoom and other technologies like that make it so much easier to work in anywhere. And we're also seeing, in terms of where are jobs popping up, we're seeing more and more jobs and growth in terms of professional and service occupations. It's not like, we don't see, lots of new factories popping up, industrial jobs like maybe our parents did and our grandparents. It's more professional, more service industry. And job sharing is also becoming more common. It might be, for example, you might have 2 people working the same job in the sense that maybe a 40-hour job is split up, 20-20 between 2 different people. Maybe they're in the same household, maybe they're not, but that's becoming more common. So the shape and nature of work is changing. In terms of your best bet occupations, this is 2008 to 2018. I mean, some of this might be outdated by now, but I imagine some of it is still quite relevant. I mean, network systems and data communication analysts still going to be huge. Financial examiners, I mean, physical assistants, I mean, anything working in medicine, dental, medical, all of that stuff is going to be so incredibly relevant, especially post-pandemic or post-life, living within the pandemic. All of these things are going to be very important. What about the nation? What about the relationship between education and earnings? They are earnings. Your life, the money you make in your life is tied, pretty strongly to your level of education. But we need to be careful because just because you have a college education doesn't mean that you guaranteed a job or guaranteed a certain salary, because we do see college graduates nowadays are underemployed, meaning they're not necessarily getting the jobs in terms of pay or status or whatever that are reflective of the training they have. Like, for example, like having seen a college graduate graduate, might be a college graduate, might go and work at, management and retail instead. That's not what they were trained for, but that's the job they can get, and it's a job that pays the bills. And this is not me insulting research, retail management, but let's say if you went to school for mathematics and you're not able to get a job in mathematics and you got a job in, retail, that would probably be, again, that's underemployed in the sense that your talents are not being probably adequately used. And this is most likely if the college reading level and writing qualitative skills, mathematics are poor. So, it's not just, there's more to it than there's more factors that influence and then just, but we are seeing, if you want to see the relationship between money and earnings and education, look no further. I mean, if you have less than a ninth grade education, you're on average, you're going to, men or women are going to earn less than 30,000. But we can see linearly, this goes up quite a bit the more education you have, a bachelor's degree you have. Also notice there is a gap between males and females. Men consistently earn more money when we factor in education, they're making more money, perhaps even doing the same job. So there is a gap, a gender gap for sure. Workforce diversity, the workplace is becoming more diverse as our country becomes more diverse, as our, that's also reflected in our labor force. It's all our labor force is just simply everyone who is employed or currently unemployed but are still looking for work. If you're, sometimes you hear like the unemployment rate or you hear statistics talked about, in terms of employment, this is what they're referring to. We have seen changes in terms of the demographic nature of labor. There are more women, for example, entering the labor force, and even for women with younger children, it's become more ethnically and racially diverse. We're also seeing more and more, sexual orientation diversity, gay and lesbian workers entering the workforce. However, there is still the existence of discrimination, and discrimination, it still exists. So you can read more about that. I want to say this might be a famous case about discrimination in the workplace. Honestly, my memory eludes me, so I apologize, but I'm going to move forward. So in terms of entering the workforce, we do see that there's more women entering the workforce, slightly less men, less the workforce, over the course of, 28 years, we see increase in various racial ethnic groups in both, male and female. So the workplace is becoming more and more diverse on so many different levels. But however, we have to, with that in mind, there are with the changing nature of the workforce, it's important to consider that discrimination takes place, bias takes place, wage gaps happen. So discrimination against women and minorities, even though it is illegal, still happens. I think we talked about this in a previous chapter. Women and minorities are also more likely to face what's called a glass ceiling, basically an invisible social barrier that prevents them from advancing within their career or their occupation. The opposite end of that spectrum, the sticky floor phenomenon, looking at women and minorities getting stuck in low paying opportunities. So both of those phenomena perhaps could be negatively influencing the workplace status of both women and minorities. And then if you consider if you're a woman and a minority in a workplace, it could potentially even compound the issue. Okay. All right. So when we think about the workplace of diversity, the workplace is becoming more diverse, but there may be instances where, if you're working for a company and you're the only woman or you're the only member of a minority group, you might be sort of viewed socially as a quote unquote token member of that group. Basically, you represent, like if you're the only Black employee at this company or at this office, you are the token Black employee, quote unquote. And it also, which could lead to things like more scrutiny on the job, more stereotyping, more judgment, also putting more performance pressure on the individual. And this is not good. This is going to create more stress on the job than there perhaps even needs to be. So how do you change this? I mean, really, it's coming down to making cultural changes, how people are managing their time and people, and how they make decisions at work needs to change. Calling it what it is, it's prejudice in the workplace, even if it's not overt racism discrimination like we might think of when we think of those words, but it's a form of prejudice. We also see programs like affirmative action. Those are intended to reduce some of those, the career differences, whether we're talking about females, whether we're talking about racial ethnic minorities. However, there are opponents to that who view it as quote unquote reverse discrimination or reverse racism. Proponents of affirmative action argue, though, that this actually combats privilege. For example, the idea that white males should have a certain place in society, and it opens up the door for other people to have opportunities as well. I know that word privilege might make some of you uncomfortable, especially when we think about it in terms of, white privilege. You might be white yourself and hearing that and think, oh, I'm white and I don't have privilege, but the world is very different, whether you recognize it or not. The world is quite different if you are a white male, versus any other status group in this country. Even if you are a poor white male, you have a certain privilege of just simply being white that others, and being male, for example, that's just not present for other people. Okay, let's look at coping with occupational hazards, because work's fun, but it's still work. And one of the hazards we're going to look at is stress. So at the end of this section, you'll be able to recognize important sources of job stress, summarize the effects of job stress on physical and mental health, describe the prevalence and consequences of sexual harassment, and identify some causes and effects of unemployment. So job stress, we all get, even jobs we love, for example, can cause stress. And stress comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes. And there are a number of sources for where stress comes from on the job. One, it could be your hours. Like if you're just working a lot of hours. We think of the full-time work week as 40 hours, but the average work week for most Americans is probably more like somewhere between 48 and 60 hours. Which the more you add on to that, that's less time you have for yourself, less time you have for your family and things like that. Not having privacy, high noise levels, poor conditions, especially if you're talking about jobs involving manual labor, rotating shifts. So maybe one, certain period of time you're working nights, certain period of time you're working days, that can throw off your sleep schedule, all kinds of things. Deadlines, lack of control, inadequate resources, perceived inequities, feeling like, hey, maybe people are making more than me, or maybe I'm treated in differently, things like that. Fears about your job, like it could be downsized. Could you lose your job? Could you lose benefits like healthcare, or is your healthcare good enough to maybe there's things you need medically and your healthcare doesn't cover it? Politics, conflicts, subordinates, co-work, all of these things. So just general office politics can cause stress. But other things, kind of the key culprits that psychologists, like workplace psychologists, have identified, especially when we talk about having to work more with people in our job, handling different difficult customers and customer service jobs. Like I worked at a retail for about 8 years, between high school, college, and then trying to find a job in teaching, for example. And, that was the number one complaint. I liked, for the most part, retail was fine, except for like 1 out of 20 customers. And that one who was just, kind of a jerk and just makes your whole day, ruins your whole day. Unpredictable economy. Like right now, as I'm recording this video, there's a lot of concerns about inflation, things like that, recession, keeping up with changes in technology, learning how to interact with more diverse coworkers, maybe being overloaded in your role, not having enough boundaries between role and work life. Thinking about this, according to Karasek, there are 2 major factors that determine occupational stress. One is the psychological demands of the job, and 2, how much control do you have? The most stressful jobs are the ones that are high in demand and low in control. And we can look at this on an axis. So jobs that have a lot of decision, maybe low demand, versus high demand and low decision making. So for example, being a telephone operator, being a server, a firefighter, those may be pretty stressful because you don't have a lot of, control. If you're a firefighter, you're trying to get to sleep, you don't have control. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, you get a call and says, hey, you got a fire to come take care of. This house is burning down, this neighborhood is burning down, and that can be, quite stressful. Other effects of job stress. Having more stress on the job is not a good thing. It increases accidents on the workplace, increases absenteeism, lowers job performance, increases turnover rates, meaning people leaving their job with more stress leads to higher turnover. Also can lead to burnout, which is mental and physical health kind of merging, exhaustion, cynicism, poor job performance. Your personality and the nature of your work can also influence your level of burnout burnout. Remember previously on a slide, we said it's best if you can match your personality with the job setting. And if there's an incompatibility there, you're more likely to get burned out. If you just, if it doesn't fit you for whatever reason, it's not good. So how can you deal with stress? There are kind of three different levels of intervening and dealing with stress. There's at the individual level, like someone who's stressed out by their job, they could leave their job. You could find a new job. You could find a job that's a better fit. Or you could find new ways to deal with stress. Like maybe you decide, oh, my job is stressful, but I still like it. So I'm going to find a new way to cope with stress. Maybe I'm going to exercise more, whatever. Intervention at the organizational level and intervention at the individual organizational interface, how the organization or intervenes and works with their clients or works with their employees. So intervention at the organization level might be, oh, we're going to pay you better. We're going to cut your hours so you're not feeling like you got to work 48, 50, 60 hours every week. We're going to give you more time, more resources, whatever. A specific occupational hazard that is it's more prone. It does happen to both. It does happen to men and women, but let's not kid ourselves. Sexual harassment is more likely to happen to women in the workplace than it is men. And so it's more important, I think, that we keep it within those contexts. It again does happen to men, does happen to women, both, but much more likely to happen to women. And this is unwelcome conduct towards an employee, based on their gender. And it comes in many shapes and sizes. It can be quid pro quo, which is asking for, sexual acts in return for things like hiring, promoting, job security. It also might be hostile work environment, engaging in certain unwanted sexual behavior, discussing, telling jokes, things like that are just going to make someone uncomfortable. How prevalent is it and what are the consequences? It happens, it's fairly widespread. About 25% of females and 16.3% of males have reported experienced some form of sexual harassment. And the consequences include being more negative emotions like anger, sadness, depression, lower self-esteem at the work, increased anxiety, lower productivity, decreased commitment to the job and employer, and again, burnout. So, nothing is good about this. There's not a single good thing about it at all. And again, happens to men and women both. What are the responses? They can be, depending on how companies or organizations address it. There's avoidance and denial. There's confrontation and negotiation. There's social coping, maybe getting help from somebody else. And there's advocacy seeking, a supportive response by the organization, saying, hey, we are not going to tolerate this. Another occupational hazard is losing your job, and this is unemployment. Losing your job, this can go from, and this has happened for a number of reasons. Maybe the nature of your job is changing, going from manufacturing to service economies. Like there are industries, for example, that were here 30, 40 years ago that are just not, or they're so reduced now that individuals have had to make career changes. The world has gotten smaller in the sense that it's opened up more. It's become more globalized. The marketplace is not just where you live. It could be all around the world. Think about, we can send and ship products anywhere at any time now. Also, economic conditions displace workers. They're unemployed basically because their jobs have disappeared. Think about travel agents. That used to be a job that was quite, was a really popular job. There was probably movies about travel agents and TV shows and things like that. And it's like, now we have a website that does that for people. It's like Google Flights or, Expedia.com or whatever. That's basically replaced displaced workers. And if you were in that industry, you had to figure out, how am I going to adapt? How am I going to change? What are the causes, or what are the results of the unemployment? It is associated with economic and health problems, physical and mental health. Middle-aged workers, for example, have more financial responsibility and fewer career options, and find it most difficult because, let's say you've been working in your field for 20, 30 years and all of a sudden you get laid off, or that job is gone, it's no more. You have less options. It may not be possible to go back to school, for example. And also the stress of jobs can lead to violence, specifically domestic violence. Getting stressed out, feeling like you can't take care of your family and take care of yourself can have huge ramifications in relationships, specifically even violence. So how do people cope with unemployment? You can apply for unemployment benefits as soon as possible. That's highly recommended. Figure out what your income and expenses are. Figure out what can I cut immediately? Lower your expenses and think of new ways to bring in extra money. Maybe while you're waiting to find a new job, you go and cut people's yard. My dad used to do that whenever, he worked at General Motors and they'd lay people off for a certain period of time. He would go cut yards for a while just to make, some extra money while he was waiting around. Stay mentally and physically healthy. Reach out for support and get organized and get going. Get on LinkedIn, get your resume, keep your resume up to date. Don't let there be a gap, in your resume for too long. How do you balance work and social life? How do you avoid becoming a workaholic? So after this section, you'll be able to articulate current perspectives on workaholism, explain work-family conflict, and discuss the benefits of multiple roles. Define leisure and list several leisure activities, things that you can do outside of work to derive pleasure. Being a workaholic, I think we live in a country that is considered a good thing. Being workaholic is an admirable trait. A workaholic is someone who devotes nearly all of their time, their time and energy to their jobs, and they kind of fall into one of two camps. You have an enthusiastic workaholic who just really derives joy from it. They're immersed in their work. They really find it maybe meaningful. Versus the non-enthusiastic workaholic who just feels like they have to work. They're driven to do hard work, but they don't really enjoy it. Maybe they feel like a sense of urgency to do it. Like maybe it's for money or whatever reason. And the individuals in the latter, the non-enthusiastic workers, tend to report lower job satisfaction and a lower sense of purpose in their job. However, both groups typically experience a high degree of conflict between work and family. They're really focusing more on the work life and maybe neglecting the family side of things. And this kind of picture here depicts a funny instance of being a workaholic. So one of these two individuals is worried about not being able to get their work done, even with the free time on their hand. They're thinking about work and yet they're stranded. Anyways, I don't want to explain the joke, but so a lot of people in their work career life, maybe you're experiencing this now, kind of balancing that, the needs for both. We do see more nowadays. It's more common to see dual earner households who are also juggling multiple roles. You're a parent, you're a husband or wife, you're also an employee, or you might be an employer even. You might even run a business. And we do see there's that work-family conflict between working families, which can create stress. And especially if there's not a lot of flexibility, if the less flexibility, more likely to see stress. And how your work and home are balanced also will differ across generations, as we see younger generations, perhaps using technology to help balance some of those things, being more comfortable or being more able to work from home, perhaps to kind of keep the balance more equal. We see differences in how Gen X people right now, 23, 37, boomers, 38, 57, have different, in terms of how they view the importance of the work life. We see an increase in family centric compared from Gen Z to boomers, and a decrease in work centric to work from Gen Z to boomers, or Gen X, excuse me, not Gen Z. Leisure is basically the time. What do you do with your time when you're not at work? And 60% of workers say that having leisure time, those sort of unpaid activities that you choose to do in your own time, is very important. Like I play club rugby when I'm not, working, and it's one of my favorite things to do. It's what gets me through the day and the work day sometimes, is knowing I have, that kind of leisure activity at the end of the day, or at the end of a work day to get into. However, American workers work longer hours. They take fewer vacation days than Europeans, meaning they have less time for leisurely activities. They have less time to spend in the garden, maybe, than our European counterparts. Leisurely activities can come in many shapes and sizes: hobbies, reading, browsing the internet, maybe it's on your phone or your computer, traveling, games, sports, TV, voluntary activities, giving to others, charity, things like that can also be considered leisurely. So the more time we can make for leisure activities, the better for our mental health and even our physical health. Okay, what can you do to get ahead in the game in terms of finding a career? At the end of this section, you'll be able to summarize the guidelines for putting together an effective resume, discuss strategies for targeting companies where you would like to work, and outline several strategies for landing a job interview, and discuss how to behave during the actual interview once you land the interview. So when you're putting together a resume, you want to use high quality white, ivory, or beige paper. However, that direction seems less relevant now that we use digital resumes a lot of times, like LinkedIn, other services. Your resume may not even be physical. So take this one with a grain of salt. Make sure there are no errors in terms of make sure you don't have typos or grammatical errors. Ideally, you want to keep it short and succinct and sweet. If you can, keep your resume to one page only. Try not to use full sentences. Avoid using the word I. Talk more about action words, verbs, like instead of I was a manager of a team of 10 people for 5 years, you might just say I supervise a team of 10 people, bullet point. And avoid superfluous personal information. If they want to know it, they'll probably ask you during the interview. Putting together a resume, some things you might want to consider. A good resume has the following: a heading, which contains your name and contact information, the objective. So you're applying to this position. This is what I want, your education and your experience. And again, you want to keep this to about 1 page. Here's an example, 1 page, got your information here, your objective, education, employment. And again, if you have leftover space, maybe you include honors and activities, perhaps. But again, I can't stress this enough. You want to match your sort of personality, your interest with the career, the setting, so you want to make sure you're choosing a setting that you actually want to work in. And you can maybe look up some examples about the job or find manuals about the job. You might do some search about the job, finding various career services or career sites, or maybe again meeting up with somebody who is in that career and getting a sense of what they do. What happens? How do you land the interview? If you're applying to the position, submit a cover letter and a resume. A lot of times services like LinkedIn will help you build both. Research the organization really shows that you have an interest. So for example, like when you go to the interview and you bring up specific things about like the workplace culture or their mission statement or whatever, that could really go a long way. And also approach companies that when, in terms of their advertising their positions, send your cover letter, explain your interest. And also you might use personal contacts, maybe, use your social network to your advantage to help find open positions. Don't be afraid to ask around or ask for help. What can you do in terms of the interview itself? Send positive nonverbal cues, lean forward, have your arms open as opposed to closed, smile a lot and nod. Remember, they are forming a first impression of you, and that first impression is likely the difference between you getting a call back and not. So you want to form a good first impression. Don't give more information than the interview requests. If they don't ask you a question, you don't have to answer questions that are not being asked. Try to do research about the company ahead of time. Ask questions during the interview. Like there might literally be a time at the very end to ask questions. Go ahead and prepare questions ahead of time. Like don't ideally don't come up with them on the spot. If you have like maybe 3 or 4 or 5 ahead of time, bam, you can really come across as someone who is engaged and knowledgeable and cares. Avoid discussion of salary at the first interview. Maybe that's you start negotiating those things in the second or final interview, perhaps. But those are just some things to consider once you actually land the interview. So that's going to do it for chapter number 13. We are going to stop here and pick back up on chapter 14, which I believe is a discussion on mental health. So I will see you all on the other side for chapter 14. Take care. Bye.